The word detachment is a really interesting situation because it's the English translation of the Sanskrit concept of vairagya, right? So vairagya, which is what's emphasized in all of the teachings, the spiritual teachings, gets translated into English as detachment, non-attachment. And so on a spiritual path, we work on how do we detach ourselves. The problem is that I'm a scientist by nature and by history, and I'm a very watchful person. The scientist in me, the psychologist in me, and what I noticed very early on in India, because it was only when I came here and learned about the spiritual tradition that I heard all of this about detachment. And I looked around and I looked at the most enlightened masters I knew. The ones who had really reached there. So my guru, Pujya Swamiji. Other enlightened saints in whose presence I had the blessing to be. And what I found was they were the most connected, engaged, present, active people. And it completely went against the teaching that said detach, 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 detach. And you'd see, so many people who were not really the enlightened ones, but sort of considered themselves high spiritually. And they were the ones who were really separate, who always kind of had this very sullen look on their face. And, you felt like you could fall down and start to bleed at their feet. And they would, just say, your karma, or, they'd turn around because they were so detached. And they prided themselves on it. I mean, there's a lot of people I've heard over my 2+ decades in India pride themselves on how unattached they are. And well, this person was, really, really sick, but it didn't impact me at all, and I was totally okay. Or this person was going through a really hard time, and I was going to help them, but, I'm practicing vairagya, and I didn't. And I watched this for a long time in my life when I first came, and I was really studying this because I thought this doesn't make any sense. And many years later, I was listening to a beautiful lecture being given by a saint on various aspects of the scriptures, and he was speaking about the manifestation, or rather the embodiment of these virtues, whether we say vairagya, whether we say bhakti, devotion. Well, in the scriptures, these were actually people, characters. We talk about them just as virtues, but actually there are stories of Bhakti, who was a being, and she took birth, and she traveled, right? And there's stories of Bhakti. So Vairagya is Bhakti's son. Bhakti gives birth to Vairagya. And the minute that I heard that in this lecture, suddenly inside me I went, oh. And it suddenly all made sense to me, because Bhakti is not just dry devotion. Bhakti is like juicy devotion. We talk about ras, right? The essence, the juice of Bhakti. And how could juicy love and devotion give birth to dry apathy? Like it doesn't make any sense. And it was then that I realized something I'm deeply committed to, and I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, so I can't give this to you semantically, but I deeply believe that detachment is not the correct English translation of Vairagya. I believe that here's what happens. You have bhakti, because if you're going to have a son, you have to first have the mother. So you have devotion. You have juicy, excited, beautiful, overflowing love for God. That love for God makes your attachment to all other things much less. And so the most natural outcome of a real deep, heart-filled, ras-filled, essence-juicy love for God is that I'm going to naturally be less attached to other things. And so I would translate Vairagya as reattachment rather than detachment. And so what I've done, instead of pushing away the things of the world, is I have reattached myself to God in such a way that that becomes my full experience. Now, what then happens is something very interesting. When you look at the enlightened masters, and again, because I'm a scientist, it's all about, what do you see? What is the data? Tell me. Well, my data from living with the enlightened masters is those who are the most deeply connected to God are the ones who experience God in all of the creation. And so whether it's sick people or hungry people or poor people or women without toilets or rivers that are being polluted or trees that are being cut down, whatever it is, their heart goes out to want to serve because they are literally experiencing the divine in all of those. And so that's where you get the connection and the love and the service. So the detachment is not a detachment of, oh, you fell down, well, that must be your karma. And look how highly spiritually evolved I am because I didn't worry about you. But rather, my connection to the divine is so much that I see the divine in you. You fall, I am the first one to bend down and pull you up. But it's from a very different place than if I had gone without this via bhakti. I'm not helping you up. I'm not serving you for me. I'm doing it because of my connection to the divine. And so when you talk about detachment from loved ones specifically, it's not going to work to push them away. Never works. The way to get over the attachment is to separate in your mind love from agenda. There is no teaching that says thou shalt not love your loved ones. When we speak about attachment, it's an attachment to what they do, how they live, how they dress, how they speak, the choices they make. By all means, love them. Have this bhakti. love the divine in them. Love essence. But we let go of our attachment to the drama. What they're doing, where they're going, what choices they're making, where they are. Because as we were just talking about, at the end of the day, everybody dies. Either you're going to die first or they're going to die first. One or the other, I guarantee you, will happen. And so there's going to come a time when you lose their physical form, whether you lose it because you're dying or you lose it because they're dying. But if you can shift the focus of your love onto the spirit of them, the divine in them, the essence of them, doesn't mean that you're not going to be sad when they die. Of course you will be. Losing a loved one is something that takes a chunk out of us. But you will at least have already had the awareness, the experience of loving them as essence, loving them as divine, which doesn't change even when the body goes. But if you've stayed directly attached only to what the body's wearing, where the body is, what the body's doing, then that's all you have. And when that day comes that you lose them, whether you lose them to death, or long before that you lose them because your kids grow up and they move out, or you lose to divorce, if it's a spouse, whatever the situation may be, the more your love is in the form of attachment to the day-to-day drama, the more painful that loss will be. And also the more painful your day-to-day life is. Because nobody, whether they're your child or your spouse or your parents, nobody wants to be told how to live. And so the more attached you are to your agenda of what they're going to do and how they're going to do it and where they're going to do it and who they're going to do it with, even while they are still in your presence, there's going to be suffering. And so the non-attachment to this is to ease the suffering. Ease the suffering while they are with you. Ease the suffering when they're no longer with you. And bring you into a place of actually, interestingly, a much deeper love. Because as I began by saying, these enlightened masters are the ones whose love is even the deepest. Because it doesn't have the attachment. It's not, I love you because you did what I want you to do. Or I love you because you're where I want you to be, or you're with the people I want you to be with. It's I love you for you. And so it takes you into a much more beautiful state of love. And that's where we have to go through bhakti. Bhakti doesn't only necessarily mean I sit in my mandir and I do puja. Bhakti is devotion for God in all forms. And in relationship, can my devotion to God involve seeing the divine in the form of my loved ones? It's not God in all except the people I live with, or God in all except the people I work with. It's God in all. So we go via bhakti. Because when you're deeply, deeply devoted to, in love with the essence of God, and able to connect with that essence of the divine in the form of your loved ones, as you say, ironically, the detachment comes. It seems like it's the opposite. You would think that in order to have the detachment, you'd have to cut yourself off from love. But actually, the deeper the love is, when it's a love of the divine, that's when the detachment happens. Because then you know, regardless of what they're wearing, regardless of where they are, regardless of whether they've even divorced you, grown up, moved out, left you, gone somewhere, whatever, whether it's spouse, children, whatever. That love is there. And so I'm not so hooked in to what they're doing. But it goes through not pushing them away, not cutting myself off from love, but expanding my love in such a way that I'm loving God through them. And so weaving it back with her question earlier about your needs and others' needs, well, if I'm loving God through them, then serving them gives me an opportunity to serve God. And for you, with the detachment, seeing God in them enables me to stay connected to them, to love them in my heart, without having the suffering that attachment brings. Whether it's bringing me suffering today because of how they're living and what's happening and the choices they're making, or whether it's going to bring me inevitable suffering later on when I lose them, to growing up or to divorce or to death. At least death is inevitable. Growing up is also inevitable. Your kids are going to grow up and move out, and you're going to lose them to death, either your death or their death. So if we refocus our love on the love of the divine, for all, and you asked about loved ones, but this is true for everyone, then actually we become even much more able to serve the world. Because the last piece of this is, if my love hasn't gone through devotion to God, if it's just love for you, well, I'm not only attached to what you do, but I need you to do things the way I want them for me. I've got my whole peace, my whole okayness wrapped up in what you're doing, wrapped up in this relationship, which is also quite a bit of pressure for you. Because you know you've got to dance according to my tune, or I'm going to come apart. Which isn't the fertile ground for a very evolved, enlightened relationship of any sort. And then, of course, that which we practice with our loved ones, we practice with the world. So the vairagya becomes not about pushing the world away, not about this I'm cut off sort of pseudo enlightenment, but that's actually just apathy and indifference, which is not spiritual. Apathy and indifference are not virtues. Which it's important to remember, because as we talk about vairagya, people start to, really think, oh God, I'm so great. Look at how apathetic I am. Look at how indifferent I am. People will say, oh, I've become very aloof. And I think, and you say that like it's a good thing. I mean, people say it actually like I should say, wow, I'm so proud of you. That's wonderful. Wow. Congratulations on your aloofness. But that's not a virtue. We don't need an aloof society. We need an engaged society. But we need to be engaged in a way that's not about how I want it, when I want it, what I want. I'm engaged because I'm connected to the divine. And therefore, that love for the divine is so much that I've let go of my attachment to these little nitty-gritty things that really don't matter. And I'm able to connect with essence, therefore, instead, and love essence, and be much more effectively engaged, efficiently engaged, because I'm not attached to the day-to-day drama.